We originally titled this AvGas, The Path Towards an Unleaded Future, but Doug, our speaker tonight, really wants to call it General Aviation Gasoline. Where have we been, where are we now, and where are we going? So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Doug here and let him go ahead and take us from the past to the present. So welcome, Doug.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you very much. And good evening, everybody. It's nice to be with my EAA family this evening. As many of you know, this is a topic that's been in the trade press and the media quite a bit over the last year or so. But we've been talking about aviation gasoline in a very concerted way, and of course before that Autogas, really for the last 20 years. And we're going to cover some of that tonight to bring you up to the level of understanding at general terms to where we are today from what we've done over the last 20 years and where we see the future going as it relates to fuel for our piston-powered general aviation aircraft. So to do that, we want to start out first with a brief history of gasoline used for aviation. This is a very quick survey, just a means of quickly bringing us from where we began to where we are today. Think back to the Wright Brothers in 1903. They're the first people to use gasoline in an aircraft, despite what Adam Smith is going to tell you in December. And back then it was, of course, Autogas. That was all there was. And there was no such thing as an octane rating scale then. So we have to take a guess or a wag at what we think the properties of the gasoline was back then in 1903. And it was probably anywhere from a 40 to a 70 octane. But it was certainly a far cry from what we're accustomed to. As we move forward in time, 1917, the U.S. Army adopted the first aviation gasoline specification as we know it. It was a mil spec, and it was called fighting grade. Later on in 1921, tetraethyl lead was discovered by General Motors, and that really began the transition to the type of fuels that we know today. In 1930, the U.S. Army Air Corps adopted the first leaded AvGas, and just by point of reference, that gasoline contained 3 milliliters per gallon of tetraethyl lead. And today, our 100 low lead contains about 2 milliliters. So they really weren't too far off. And that was when we began to approach the 100 octane levels that we're accustomed to today. Gasoline and aviation gasoline reached really the pinnacle of its development toward the end of World War II in 1944 with the introduction of the 115-145 grade. This was the highest octane aviation gasoline ever produced in a large-scale sense, and really it's what allowed us to also reach the zenith of piston air-cooled engine development. So as we made our way from 1903 to 1944, 1945, as aviation gasoline progressed in its capabilities in octane, so too did that enable the development of ever higher horsepower aircraft engines. So it's very important to note that all of our engines and our technologies have been driven by advancements in fuel. By the 1950s, we were producing 6 different grades of aviation gasoline in this country. And as you can see from this chart here, it was ranged anywhere from a 73 octane with no lead all the way up to the 115-145 with up to 4.6 grams per gallon of tetraethyl lead. I listed on the right column there the different levels of lead in each of the different grades just for a point of reference. And those are the maximum lead contents permissible under the specifications. The average production may have had somewhat less than that, but as you can see, there was quite a difference in the lead content of the various fuels. By the 1960s, demand for high-octane AvGas really began to plummet, and obviously that was with the proliferation of the development and implementation of turbine engines in the commercial service. Also coinciding with that same time frame, general aviation manufacturers of piston engines began to put out service instructions that limited the use of the highest octane, highest lead content aviation gasolines in the lower compression engines. And this was due to lead fouling of the plugs and things like valve sticking and wear. So they began to see problems with some of our lower octane, lower compression engines with these high lead content fuels. In 1970, this was a seminal moment. The Clean Air Act was signed into law by Congress, and this was really the first time that lead became a target of environmental activity. And clearly from that point forward, we've seen lead being eradicated from virtually all facets of life in this country and really worldwide. And of course, aviation gasoline was in the sights, but we managed to go quite a long time without any specific regulation. In 1971, as a result of both the Clean Air Act and the troubles that we were having from a service standpoint throughout the 60s with the high lead fuels in low-octane engines, all of the highest octane grades of AvGas were consolidated down to a single AvGas we know today as 100 low lead. And as I said earlier, that contained about a maximum of about 2 grams per gallon of tetraethyl lead. This was beneficial, obviously, from a production and distribution standpoint. We were taking these multiple grades and bringing them down to 1. It also had the benefit of dramatically reducing the lead emissions from general aviation aircraft by a factor of nearly 50%. In 1974, EAA began its efforts to gain approval for the use of autogas in type certificated aircraft, and not coincidentally, that coincided with the OPEC oil embargoes. We all remember gas lines and things like that back in the early and mid-70s, and we were at that time really under the belief that we were going to lose our supply of aviation gasoline, and so the ability to tap into the broadest based, most widely available source of gasoline was very, very important strategically and economically for general aviation. So that's what really got that ball rolling. By 1983, the first STCs were issued for 87-octane autogas, and then in 1988, the first STCs were issued for the 91-octane autogas. And then we had a watershed moment. In 1990, the EPA Clean Air Act amendments were passed by Congress. This was really the moment, the wake-up call for all of us. There was a provision in the language in the bill that would have forced the elimination of lead in all non-road vehicle fuels by 1995. So in a very short 5-year window, we believed that we were going to lose the aviation gasoline that we had come to know. Fortunately, during the course of our activities here in Washington, to look at the congressional record and work with folks on the Hill, we were able to find a technicality, frankly, in the congressional record that made it clear that aircraft are not non-road vehicles and aircraft are regulated separately. So by virtue of something of a technicality, we were able to show that the 1995 deadline didn't specifically apply to us. However, at the same time, it became clear that the EPA had the authority to regulate lead and avgas at any time since 1970. So it was a good news, bad news story. On the one hand, we got off the hook of the immediate deadline, but the fact remained that at any moment EPA could, in fact, undertake the regulation of lead. But that seminal moment brought us all together in what was called at the time the Fuel Crisis Conference held here in Washington, D.C. And it was really the first time that all of the parties concerned with avgas came together to discuss the lead issue specifically. And at that meeting were owners and type clubs, owners associations of type clubs, the petroleum refiners and resellers and distributors, as well as engine manufacturers and airframe manufacturers. So really all of us were in the room at the same time for the first time. And so began, frankly, 20 years of research to understand the technical complexities and the limitations of trying to replace lead in high-octane aviation gasoline. We'll talk more about that as we go along. In 1999, the 82 UL AvGas specification was passed. Now this was a 12-year effort by EAA and some folks out at Cessna to try to develop an aviation-grade aviation gasoline spec that was based on automotive gasoline base stock. So we viewed this at the time as particularly important because autogas was changing very, very rapidly in the 90s. You were seeing lots of external pressures from environmental concerns and other interests, economic interests, making changes to the specifications. And very notably was the introduction of oxygenates and reformulated gasoline. This really called into question the Autogas STC program that we had. And we were concerned that we really weren't sure how this was going to play out. So the 82 UL effort was really an effort to freeze the specification, to create an aviation-grade specification based on that massive pool of MoGas that's available out there. And at the same time, it was intended to remove many of the real and perceived concerns that have precluded autogas from being sold broadly at airports, such as liability and quality assurance and some of those things. This was an AvGas spec, so the idea was this could potentially bring MoGas grade fuel to the airport. And of course it precluded the use of alcohols. And this spec is available today. It's been on the shelf since 1999. Unfortunately, there's been no production or distribution to date, which frankly begs a question in our minds. This is there. It's available to be used. Anybody could make a buck selling this 82UL on airports, but it's not happening. So the question becomes then, are the economies of scale there for a widely distributed second grade of AvGas? So far, the market has indicated no. It is a complex issue. There's a variety of factors as to why that's the case, but the reality is we've made it technically possible to do, but the marketplace hasn't adopted it. So right now, external forces are changing virtually everything we know about piston engine aircraft fuel formulation and its availability, and that's what we're all here for tonight, of course. So clearly, the types of fuel that we use in aviation are two. There's the 100 low-lead high-octane AvGas, and it meets the octane needs of our entire fleet of general aviation aircraft. However, it has some problems of its own. As we've talked about, there are lead fouling problems on the low compression engines, and this is a real problem for the new light sport aircraft category, many of which, almost all of which have low compression engines, but many of which also have Rotax engines, and 100 low-lead just simply isn't going to do the job for them. The other alternative has been MoGas or Autogas. I use the terms interchangeably. In the specification world, it's referred to as MoGas. In our STCs, of course, we call it Autogas. This is a low-octane, relatively automotive gasoline. The octanes range anywhere from 87 to 91, which, when we talk about aviation octane ratings, is equivalent to roughly 82 to 87. Please note the difference there. It's an important one. We can technically use MoGas in a large percentage of the general aviation fleet. There's no question about that. It does have, however, insufficient octane and a few other properties for some of the high-performance segment of the fleet, which is approximately 30% of the aircraft out there. But admittedly and recognizably, we can burn this fuel in a very large number of aircraft. So what's the difference between AvGas and Autogas? Well, frankly, everything. Only the term gasoline is the same. In simple terms, Autogas is a distillate. If you can take a barrel of oil and you can boil off different constituents of the oil at different temperatures using different equipment and so forth, but you basically can distill out gasoline. It's a straight distillate. So as you can see from the graphic here, if you took the proverbial barrel of oil in 2009, this graphic shows you, in terms of percentages, what portions of a barrel go to what products in North America. And as you can see from the slide, the gasoline makes up by far and away the largest portion of the nationwide annual barrel of oil per se. So that's what makes MoGas just relatively simple to do, to make, and cheaply and in large quantities. It is a straight distillate. AvGas, on the other hand, is not a distillate. It is a specialty chemical. It is a blend of specialty chemicals. And isooctane, or reformate, is the basis of it. We call it aviation alkylate. And it goes through some rather exotic processes, hydrocracking and alkylation processes and so forth that we won't go into any great detail on. But the fact of the matter is it's not something you just boil off a barrel of oil. It is a synthetic process that makes a specialty chemical. You add to that some toluene, and you add some tetraethyl lead, and then to get the lead out of the engine as a scavenger, you throw some benzene in, and you've got more or less a simplified version of AvGas. So what are some of the factors that affect the sustainability of Autogas today?
Hey,
it
Doug,
is readily available. Yes?
now might be a good time to ask that poll question that we had.
Oh, good idea. Exactly. In fact, we had put together a couple of questions, and having to do with what sort of fuels you use, and this will help me actually as the presenter to know a little bit about you as the audience. So, Charlie, if you would put forth that first question about the types of fuel people burn today.
I have already done so. So the question is, do you use Autogas? And then the answers are yes, no, and I would if I could, meaning I know with all the ethanol laws across the country that a lot of people have that might have used it in the past have given up on it. We've got about 65% of the votes in. I'll give everybody just a few more seconds to get their vote in. We're just topping 80% right now, so we're pretty close, 85%. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll here. So last chance to get it in. Okay, and let me go ahead and share the results. So Doug, we're at about 22% are using it right now, 40% no, but 38% saying they would if they could. So that kind of gives you a pretty good idea of the desire to use Autogas at least.
Very good. Well, that's great to know. So there's a fairly sizable percentage of the audience with an interest in Autogas. So I'm glad I included all this additional information on Autogas in the presentation tonight, which we really, as Charlie said, had intended just to focus on the AvGas, and particularly the high-octane AvGas, into the story. So back to what is affecting the sustainability of Autogas and our ability to use it, particularly that 38% that say, I'd like to use it if I could get my hands on it. It is readily available out there and will be for the foreseeable future. However, the threats come from the continual formulation changes that are brought about by a variety of influences, including politics and economics and environmental regulation, and even, frankly, changes in automotive technology. The fuel, when you go to ASTM and look at their specification, it is made for motor vehicles, not airplanes. So the entire universe of on-road, off-road, and highway vehicle manufacturers and consumers are involved in those committees. And then you've got Aviation, little voice in the corner, who says, yep, me too. So we don't have a lot of influence on this product. And huge forces are at work with a huge pool, and we'll talk more about that. But as the technological changes come about in automobiles, it allows changes in the fuel. Our products are pretty static in their technology, so we can't necessarily change with some of these changes in fuel, at least not readily. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But a bit of history here. As we said earlier, oxygenates were required in the 90s to reformulate the Autogas for environmental reasons, and that brought into question our STC program. These oxygenates were things like ethers, MTBE, ETBE, TAME, and then ethanol, which we all hear a lot about today. We did a lot of research back then to try to figure out whether we could get away with using these ethers and what their impact was on engine performance and materials compatibility. And we worked very hard with FAA to get that approval, and of course today the STC program does allow the use of ethers. However, ethanol has never been a permissible constituent in any large percentage under the Autogas STC, and it remains prohibited to this day. In 1999, as I referenced earlier, the 82 UL AvGas specification came out again, the object being to freeze the spec for aviation use and not be subject to these ever-changing whims of reformulation. Throughout the early part of this decade, we started to see a lot of tweaking of the Autogas specifications that had some, real operational impact on our use as aircraft. First of all, there was a move to increase the allowable vapor pressure. For a variety of reasons, this is to the advantage of the petroleum producers, and this poses problems for us in terms of vapor lock. We opposed that at the committees at ASTM, but again, because we're a marginal user and under the spec, actually not even a permitted user of MoGas, we're sort of in the margins. Our voice was very, very small in all of that. One other major concern that's happening today is that the octane of the base fuel, RBOB, which is reformulated BOB, is being lowered. This is a function of the fact that oxygenates, when you add them to the fuel, raise the octane level of Autogas. And when you give away octane, it costs money. So no producer wants to give away octane for free. So because of the octane-enhancing nature of oxygenates, they're actually setting about reducing the octane of the RBOB, or the basic Autogas, to compensate for the addition of these octane-enhancing oxygenates and renewables. So the result is that without ethanol in the fuel, you may not have the octane you think you have in the basic fuel. And I've heard recently of people washing Autogas, and I'm not sure I can tell you exactly what that means, but if it's removing the ethanol from reformulated gasoline, then what you are left with may in fact not have the octane you think it has, because they've reduced the octane qualities of the BOB. And then the mother of all changes. In 2005, Congress mandated that ethanol nationwide be consumed in fairly large quantities under the Energy Policy Act. And that's when we really started to see the broad nationwide adoption of E10, or 10% ethanol in our autogas. And once again, this has put the STC program in jeopardy because it's become very, very difficult to find gasoline, autogas that does not have at least 10% ethanol in it. And then to make matters worse, in 2007, Congress enacted the Energy Independence and Security Act, which doubled the near-term consumption mandates nationwide for renewables to 9 billion gallons a year in 2008, up to 15 billion in 2012, and 36 billion in 2022. That's all fine and dandy, except that to consume all of this ethanol and other renewables that Congress is mandating, EPA had to turn around and figure out how to get it all burned, how to use it all. So this year, just this month, EPA issued a final rule implementing E15, which is 15% ethanol for on-road vehicles produced on or after 2007. Now this was done in the face of opposition from EAA and everybody. I mean, we were, again, a fairly small voice in this, but you know, the worldwide automotive and marine and off-road and non-road engine manufacturing base have all opposed E15. And yet EPA has gone forward with this mandate. I want to make it clear that EAA has opposed the implementation of ethanol mandates at every turn. We have spent years and years and years fighting this at a state level before this became a nationwide issue. States were implementing these types of mandates within their own jurisdictions, and we, state legislature by state legislature, were going around the country educating them and trying to, at least if nothing else, carve out the premium grade of autogas for use in aircraft unadulterated with ethanol or other oxygenates. And we've been partially successful at that on a state-by-state basis, but we were swamped and just overcome by the national movement coming out of Congress. Pump labeling requirements was another thing that we've had to fight state by state by state because there have always been pushes to, because of the perceived pejorative nature of ethanol, petroleum producers don't want labeling on the pumps saying there's ethanol in the fuel. So there are always proposals coming up saying, you know, we won't have to label the ethanol content of the fuel. And we go around state by state and fight these things, and it is extremely time-consuming for us. And then along comes the congressional consumption mandates I just referenced. And we have tried and tried talking to people on the Hill, and frankly, right now, and for the last few years, there is no political will in Congress, even by long-standing supporters of ours, of GA, to stand up and oppose ethanol. And even if they were, they'd be the lone voice in the woods. There just simply isn't that momentum or even desire or care on Capitol Hill right now to carve out an ethanol-free premium grade of autogas or even oppose the mandates outright. And this is extremely frustrating to those of us on staff who work on your behalf because we feel your frustration and we feel your anger, and we're not insensitive or unknowing or uncaring to our own Autogas STC program and the folks who use it. So this is something that we take very hard and very much to heart. And we will continue to work on this, but you know, we have an election coming up, things may change, but right now and in the recent years, this just has not been something that we could tackle in a meaningful way. Let's switch gears from autogas for a moment to 100 low lead, because there are factors affecting the long-term availability of our AvGas. First and foremost, they're economic. There's no assurance of a long-term supply of lead and AvGas. We've known that for some time. And over the last 2 decades that we've been working on trying to develop a high-octane replacement for 100 low lead, the number of producers has diminished quite dramatically. And we're down to a single producer of tetraethyl lead in the world, and that's a company called Innospec over in England. Innospec has indicated to us as recently as this summer that they will continue to supply TEL for our AvGas as long as there's a market. They can scale down their business as world demand for lead decreases, and it is decreasing worldwide as the last automotive gasolines containing lead are being phased out. But they are committed to staying in the business. But the fact of the matter is that leaves us hanging with a sole supplier for lead for our industry, which is a concern no matter how you slice it. Again, AvGas is a specialty chemical or a niche fuel, and as you'll see in this graphic, we consume a very, very small, very low volume of AvGas compared to other transportation fuels. And as you can see, it's 0.1% of all transportation fuel. I had to stick AvGas on the end of that bar graph because if I put it in the middle, you wouldn't see it at all. The other thing is that our consumption continues to decrease. Now, we've had a little uptick in the last 3 years, but as you can see from this graphic, if you go back to 1983, which is the first point on this graph, we were burning, or at least I should say refiners were producing and delivering about 418,000 gallons of AvGas daily. And as you can see, that has fallen steadily to the point where this year, this past year in 2009, the last data available, we were burning and producing 150,000 gallons a day. So it's a pretty precipitous drop. Now, if you were to extrapolate that graph back in time, back to the 70s and 60s, it would be even more alarming. It really was a precipitous drop. But as you can see, we continue that downward trend, which affects the marketplace and the size of our marketplace, our influence, both economic and technical. Other factors affecting the availability of 100 low lead over the long term is that, in 1990 when the Clean Air Act amendments were passed, we were one of the largest sources, one of the smallest sources, of lead in the atmosphere. And over these succeeding 20 years, other sources have been mitigating their emissions and going by the wayside entirely, to the degree that today now aviation remains as the single largest source of airborne lead emissions, and that puts us at about 45% of the total. You may have seen this graph before. We've shown it a number of presentations, but as you can see from that pie chart there, general aviation is the big black circle on the right-hand side, or piece of pie, and almost double the next largest emitter, which would be the metal industries. So this hasn't escaped the attention of people like the Friends of the Earth and the Blue Water Network, who petitioned EPA in 2006 to basically do their job and control lead emissions under the Clean Air Act, which in fact, by court order, EPA is having to do. So we find ourselves where we are today with EPA undertaking the first signs of rulemaking that you've heard probably a lot about this year. So let's talk a bit about that. What is this EPA regulatory action that's ongoing? And there's a couple. The first one is a near-term action that is well underway, and that was EPA reassessing and rebaselining the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAAQS, for lead. This was a tenfold reduction from the previous allowable limit, so it was a very substantial drop in the permissible airborne lead content. And it subsequently required that states and their municipalities monitor near major sources of lead emissions, which of course, given the pie chart I just showed you, includes airports and major populated areas. When that data comes in, and it is not in yet, states will then have to determine where they are in noncompliance with the NAAQS and meet that new NAAQS standard for lead by 2017. So that's about a 7-year project we're looking at here that will bring us to the point where the states have to take specific actions to come into compliance. Now, this is not a ban on 100 low lead, and states don't have the power to do that. The concern there is that if we are not in compliance, that we could find ourselves having other means of mitigation, reducing or minimizing or otherwise curtailing the number of operations at an airport that's in noncompliance, or banning the transportation and sale of a leaded fuel at that facility. I mean, there's ways around this. The states can't influence the fuel itself, but they can nibble at the margins in meaningful ways. So this is a source of concern to us, but it doesn't mean that 100 low lead goes away in 2017 by any stretch. It means that there would have to be some control mechanisms in place in those local areas where there are non-attainment. The good news is, so far, the monitoring to date has not exceeded any of the NAAQS standards, which is fantastic news. That doesn't mean we won't find places where they do, and we have to be vigilant for this, but the good news is that so far I think there's enough dispersal of the emissions that it's not a concentration in any one area. So fingers crossed, we're keeping our eyes on that. Longer term, there's a secondary effort independent of the NAAQS standards that's going on, and that is the endangerment finding process, which is simply put, is lead a hazard to human health? Yes or no? And that's been answered yes for decades, so no question there. Is lead emitted by general aviation? Yes or no? If yes, you have an endangerment finding. It's a pretty straightforward process, but it's not as black and white as it may seem because of all these data issues that are ongoing out there. And you'll be hearing more about that, I predict, over the next 12 to 18 months as we start to get this data in. But the good news is so far we're under the limits. There was an advance notice of proposed rulemaking that was issued earlier this year that started this endangerment finding process. And you may recall that we sought and were given an extension to the comment period this summer, and then we and a coalition of folks involved in this that I'll talk about more later filed comments to the ANPRM before the close of the deadline period. Those comments are available if you're interested, if you haven't seen them, at eaa.org. Now, an endangerment finding itself, again, does not ban 100 low lead. Additional rulemaking would be required to implement any mitigating strategies. So we're at the advance notice of proposed rulemaking stage today. What would happen next is EPA would issue a notice of proposed rulemaking proposing to make an endangerment finding. There would be another comment period that would be open for us to participate in. That would close, and then sometime further down the road, a final rule would be issued, either making an endangerment finding or not. So we're in the very beginning of this process. If we get to the end of this process and there is an endangerment finding made, an additional set of rulemaking would be required to begin to propose, and with all the attendant comment periods and so forth, how we would mitigate or reduce lead emissions from GA down the road. So what I'm trying to put forth here is that this is not an imminent crisis, as some have intimated, but it is urgent. And it is absolutely a top priority issue, and we must give it our full attention, our resources, funding, and management skills. Rod Hightower, EAA's new president here, who just started a little over a month ago now, one of his first statements to me when coming on board was the following: fuel is one of our top priority initiatives and is one of the key aviation issues of our time, period. He made it abundantly clear that EAA's resources have to go to this issue because we live and die by this issue. Our community lives and dies by this issue. We get it, Rod gets it, and we're acting accordingly. So what is EAA's role in all of this? What can we do? What can't we do? First and foremost, we need to ensure that the needs of the GA fleet are met. I mean, that is our fundamental mission. In doing so, we need to make sure that we balance safety, performance, economy, and availability. Without any one of those things, we don't have a viable future fuel. We need to be a sounding board and a source for technical and policy leadership. We need to ensure that the technical bodies like ASTM, where aviation gasoline specifications are drafted and maintained, and CRC, where task-specific research is conducted, consider the needs of us, of our community, our EAA family, our pilot population out there. We need to also ensure that the regulators, such as EPA, FAA, and Congress, are sensitive to our technical, economic, and safety concerns. And we also need to ensure that funding is available by way of Congress and that oversight and coordination is provided for so that this doesn't happen in a haphazard way. It needs to be a coordinated effort moving forward. And that is today actually one of the key things that we're most engaged in. Underlying everything we do at EAA, whether we're talking about fuel or sport pilot or light sport aircraft or amateur built, it doesn't matter what we're discussing. Everything we do follows this statement. We create access and opportunity. That is our guiding principle. EAA has, over the last 40-year history, really been the preeminent place for technical and policy leadership on fuel specifications, making those specifications available, creating new specifications, and in the case of Autogas, permitting additional uses of existing specifications. And we've done that in a variety of ways listed there. You'll see we did a lot of materials compatibility testing in support of several different programs. The Autogas STC program, 82 UL, 94 UL, the high-octane unleaded research over the last 20 years. All of these things are things that EAA has been up to its eyeballs in and continues to be as we go forward. So what's happening right now? Well, from a technical standpoint, really the groundwork has been done, that the foundation's been laid for the low and mid-octane unleaded AvGas. We know the properties of what's available out there, and we pretty well know how to apply them. Obviously, autogas without ethanol is a desirable thing, and if it's politically possible, we're going to go there. 82UL could be produced and marketed today without ethanol. It could be done right now if the market's there for it. And someone with an entrepreneurial spirit could stand up and make this happen. We'd be forever grateful. We know you can produce a 91 aviation octane unleaded fuel simply by taking the lead and the benzene out of the 100 low lead AvGas we have today, just basically using aviation alkylate. The Air Force is in fact creating a specification for their purposes for UAVs, for their piston-powered UAVs, which will be in fact a 91 UL. So the technical focus now, and really for the last 20 years, the complexity lies in developing the high-octane unleaded replacement for 100 low lead, satisfying that high end of the fleet that we can't satisfy with a MoGas or any of the intermediate grades of unleaded aviation gasoline that we could have. So we're really looking for the highest practical octane. And while we're doing that, we have to maintain the existing safety margins we're accustomed to with 100 low lead. Whatever fuel we produce has to be economically feasible and readily available. And most importantly, it has to be something that is compatible with, as best as we can look into our crystal ball, with the future production of petroleum in North America and really worldwide, because frankly aviation gasoline is an international product. And we have to look at this in a way that from an environmental standpoint and a production standpoint, it is something that is sustainable. Because we're going to be making decisions about certifying new aircraft that have lifespans of decades upon decades. And so we need to ensure that whatever choices we make in this process will lead us to a sustainable fuel.
Doug?
Yeah, Charlie.
Should we do the other poll question? This seems to be an appropriate time.
Sure, let her rip.
All right. So the question is, does your aircraft require 100 octane? Pretty simple, yes, no. So if everybody could just take a second and give us your feedback on that. And we've got almost, we're over 70%, so now that everybody's figured out how to use the poll questions, this should go pretty quick. All right, we're closing in on 90%, and I'm going to go ahead and shut down the polls here momentarily. And we will share the results, and amazingly, Doug, 50-50.
50-50. Well, that actually is a somewhat higher representation for the high-octane aircraft portion of the fleet than the fleet itself would present. We estimate there to be about a 70-30 split between those that could burn an autogas-like fuel versus those that require a higher octane. And so a 50-50 split actually is weighted in favor of, at least with this particular audience, the high-octane burning crowd. So good opportunity to start talking about some of the research initiatives that are ongoing right now. As you've all probably heard and read, in 2009, Swift Enterprises really began to come out publicly and promote their research that they've been undertaking for a few years on an unleaded high-octane avgas. And the Swift fuel is stated to exceed 100 octane, and it could be potentially derived from renewable sources. I will let them do the speaking for themselves and their data do the speaking for themselves, but this is one of the clearly one of the promising initiatives that is ongoing out there. Another one that was unveiled early this year was with GAMI and their research on what they call their G100UL high-octane avgas. Unlike the Swift product, this is more of a petroleum and specialty chemical-based fuel. It would not necessarily be in fact it wouldn't be a biomass renewable fuel, but again it is stated to exceed 100 octane, and both of these initiatives are ongoing and progressing. They are both in the early days of research and development. Neither fuel has frozen its spec per se or its blend to say that this is the fuel we're going on. They're still tinkering and experimenting. So it is just that. It's research, and it's good work, and it's good research, and needs to be encouraged. There are also other work being undertaken that's not necessarily happening quite so much in the public eye at some of the petroleum producers, and so there's a lot of disparate activities going on out there that are not necessarily happening in a cohesive, coordinated way. But it is good work, it is promising work, and we'll see where the data leads us as time goes by. Another initiative you may have heard about earlier this year, probably this summer, was the 94 UL aviation gasoline. This was an initiative undertaken by Teledyne Continental, and Cirrus subsequently announced engine and aircraft programs that would be certified to a 94 unleaded aviation gasoline. Really, this was a defensive move made by these companies to assure that they had product available going forward in the event of a precipitous ban on lead. It was really not envisioned to be the next fuel. Unfortunately, it was erroneously interpreted by some folks and really widely trumpeted that this was where the industry was going. We were going to go to a 94 UL, and everybody with a high-octane aircraft or engine out there would be put out to pasture. And that just simply wasn't the case. I'm not even sure how that got started and got so much momentum. But, you know, from my perspective, just as someone who's been around this a long time, what Teledyne and Cirrus were doing was just good business. It was just making a business decision that said, come hell or high water, we're going to have a product that even under a bad situation, a regulatory situation, we'll still be in business, we'll still have something to sell, we'll still be able to support our products. It wasn't indicative that that's the direction we were going to head for the next general aviation gasoline. It was just, I think, prudent business decision, and it really got played the wrong way. And it's really unfortunate because it was a great distraction from what really needs to be going on right now, and that's research toward a high-octane replacement for 100 low lead. So this is not a new issue. I personally have been around this for 20 years, and in that time, our goal was single-mindedly and doggedly, we will find a drop-in replacement for 100 low lead. And by drop-in, we meant it's not going to require any modifications to the aircraft or aircraft-specific FAA approval for use. In other words, we were looking for the chemical silver bullet that would allow us to take out 100 low lead and put in this new elixir, and everybody would continue on their merry way. Unfortunately, that really didn't quite pan out that way. In the course of that 20 years, we tested more than 200 different unleaded blends. So an awful lot of ground was covered in terms of novel chemical attempts. In addition to those lab tests, we took 45 of the most promising blends and full-scale engine tested them. In the process, we gained a great deal of knowledge about how fuel behaves, both unleaded and leaded, in our engines, and about what the characteristics of the existing fleet were, because we didn't have any of that knowledge. All we knew when we built these aircraft was, and certified their engines, was it worked on the fuel we had. We didn't know how much does the engine or aircraft really need in terms of octane or other fuel parameters. So we've never looked at the question the other way around. We just knew it worked, so it was okay. We didn't really know the answer to, yeah, but what does it need? So we've done an awful lot of that over the last 20 years as well to give a better understanding of the landscape of our fleet as it exists today. The finding, unfortunately, was we couldn't find a drop-in unleaded replacement for 100 low lead. Today, even with some of the research initiatives that are underway, they don't qualify as drop-in. So really where we are today is we're looking for the next best thing. In other words, where can the physical property changes in the fuel be accommodated without significant compromise to safety or performance? What parameters that we're accustomed to having in our fuel specifications can we bend or move or change, and how much that will allow us the opportunity for more novel chemical experimentation, you might say. So why is this so difficult? I mean, 20 years, good golly. We've had some of the best and the brightest at this for a long time, and we keep hearing it's all about octane, right? It's all about octane. And the answer is, well, yeah, sort of, but not entirely. So let's talk very quickly about some important properties of gasoline. I'm just going to breeze over this at a very high level. We're not going to get down to, if I'm talking beneath my audience, please forgive me, because we could get into very lengthy technical discussions on properties of fuel, but just a quick survey of some of them. Obviously, octane. Absolutely right. Octane provides the knock and detonation suppression in our engines that allows the greatest possible engine-to-power weight ratios that we enjoy today. And without that, detonation is a destructive force in the engine that will ultimately lead to engine failure. When it comes to octane, more is better. There's no question about it. One thing we've learned over time throughout this 20 years of experimentation was that there's a definite difference in behavior between some leaded versus unleaded fuels for the same given octane rating. So just hypothetically, you could have two 98 octane fuels side by side, one with lead, one without. Both of them rate the same, and yet you can get a better anti-knock response from the leaded fuel. So there is something about lead that gives a greater anti-knock characteristic than the numbers, the scale, would indicate. There's a little extra oomph there. And octane is, of course, indeed critical for the preservation of the existing fleet. As we said, 30% of the fleet needs a higher octane than we could get from the currently available unleaded gasolines. And that particular portion of the fleet does burn a majority of the fuel. And there's a great deal of debate over how much. But the fact of the matter is that relatively small percentage of the fleet is a very important economic engine for the sale and distribution of AvGas. They burn more fuel per hour, and that, of course, high performance end of the fleet is skewed toward commercial and business travel and other high-use activities. So just a real quick primer on octane. We use the motor octane scale for AvGas. 100 low lead has a lean motor octane of 100 and a rich or supercharged rating of 130. Autogas, on the other hand, uses a different method. They use an average of what's called the research octane number and the motor octane number, or you may have seen it on the pump as R plus M over 2. They use, in the Autogas world, a single lean rating, which you're accustomed to seeing every day when we fill up our cars, 87, 89, 91, sometimes 93 or 94. So what? What does that all mean? Well, the fact that there are two different methods means that there's about a 5 to 6 point, depending on how you look at it, difference between AvGas and Autogas in terms of the scales and what it means to performance. So, for example, an 87 octane Autogas, regular Autogas, has what we would consider to be about an 82 octane AvGas. Similarly, a high premium Autogas, 93, would equate to roughly 87 octane AvGas. So there's a gulf there, and that's important to understand as we talk about trying to find unleaded replacements for leaded AvGas. So if we were to try to reach the equivalent of a 100 low lead using a hypothetical super blend of MoGas, it would require roughly 105, 106, maybe even more octane Autogas, of which, of course, it doesn't exist. But that gives you some sense of the gulf that we're trying to bridge here. So the gap between available Autogas and 100 octane AvGas is actually much greater than the numbers on the pump would lead you to believe. Other important properties of gasoline beyond octane: water separation. We need to ensure that the water settles out of suspension in any fuel so it can be drained away when we do our pre-flights, when we sump. If it doesn't, the water can end up in the engine or elsewhere in the fuel system, causing power loss. And of course, suspended water can freeze into ice crystals and clog the fuel system and filters in any number of places, leading also to power loss or engine failure. And this is one of the core problems when we talk about ethanol and its use in Autogas, because ethanol is highly miscible with water. It will tend to remain in suspension and cause these very problems. So any high-octane fuel also needs to have good water separation characteristics. Freeze point. Look, we don't want the fuel to freeze or gel either at altitude or on the surface under extreme cold conditions. Corrosivity. We don't want it to attack the metal components of our fuel system. And conductivity. This is one that we don't think a whole lot about, but it is very important in any aviation fuel. The ability to conduct electricity and dissipate a static charge without sparking. We don't want an explosion hazard in our aircraft. Materials compatibility of all sorts. We don't want any fuel to compromise any of the other materials in our fuel system, whether it's the fuel bladders or O-rings or seals or pump vanes or you name it, any number of non-metallic materials that we find in our aircraft. And then distillation curve. This is a sort of a weird one that is hard to talk about without getting really techy. But it is very, very important to the discussions we're having right now, today, as it relates to the high-octane AvGas replacement process. And when we talk about the curve is what shows us mathematically what's in the fuel, that you have a balance of the heavy ends, the mid-boiling range, and the light aromatics that give us the range of performance and the range of environments that we can operate successfully in with aircraft. And the reason this is important is because it contributes to things like hot start, cold start, altitude restart, and other pretty significant performance requirements. The light ends allow us to start in the cold. Heavy ends allow us to operate on hot days and not have high vapor pressures and so forth. So the curve is something that we have come to use over history through trial and error, frankly, that tells us whether we have a successful AvGas or not. And this is particularly important because two of the more public research programs that are underway, SWIFT and GAMI, are outside the curve as we know it today. In the case of GAMI, it's outside in terms of the limits a little bit, and in the case of the SWIFT fuel, which is made up of two specific components and not a range of materials giving you that heavy, light, medium curve, if you will, or blend of components, there's no curve at all. It's a step. Each component has its own characteristic, and that's it. So the question is, does that matter? And if it does, how important is it? And how much can we bend or move the curve? Or what can we do to mitigate the impact of some of those things? And so that's where we are right now. We're looking at some of the traditional specification criteria and seeing where we can move those, if possible, to allow for greater creativity in some of these novel research activities. Another one is volatility and vapor pressure. Vapor pressure, or volatility, simply is the tendency of a liquid to change to a vapor state. And this is important because we don't want vapor lock. Lower is better when it comes to vapor lock and vapor pressure. If you go too low, you don't have enough aromatics in the fuel to start the engine on a cold day, so it's a balancing act. But a high vapor pressure fundamentally means that the fuel is more likely to gas off. You're more likely to get a vapor bubble in your fuel system that will starve the engine for fuel. This, again, is another core problem when we talk about ethanol blending in autogas, because ethanol raises the vapor pressure of the fuel quite dramatically and unacceptably. So as we look to the path forward, we talked a lot about where we've been and where we are. One thing that has been clear to all of us, I think, in the industry is that we can't do this alone. It has to be a collaborative effort. We have to arrive at this end place more or less together. The marketplace has to determine what the best outcome is going to be. And EAA, for example, we could come up with what we think is the best fuel for the future of general aviation ourselves and say, this is it. But if we don't have the buy-in of the engine manufacturers and the airframe manufacturers and the FAA and the marketplace's confidence, it's not going to come to pass. So no one can do this alone. And ultimately, consensus and the marketplace will drive us to the solution. So let's talk a little bit about some of the people that are involved in all of this, because there's a cast of thousands, which makes this very complicated. Obviously, the government. Congress sets the environmental goals to be attained, and they also control things like funding and level of priority for any given issue. So we have to work with Congress. We have to have their buy-in. We have to have their cooperation. EPA sets the environmental standards to attain the goals set by Congress. They also set the implementing regulation, that is to say, mitigating actions, restrictions, what have you. That will come down the road, as we discussed earlier, but they play an important role because managing their expectations along the way is critical. FAA plays, obviously, a critical role in this. They set the safety standards for our aircraft, and ultimately they approve the use of any given fuel in our engines and our aircraft. So while they don't approve fuels per se, they approve the use of fuels. So they play an absolutely integral part in this as we make our way forward. In an industry, obviously we have the petroleum producers, we have distributors and retailers, engine manufacturers, aircraft manufacturers, ourselves, the consumers, whether it's owner groups, type clubs, individuals. And then we're all sort of bounded together under this umbrella at ASTM. ASTM doesn't write fuel specs, but they give us the forum and I guess the process, the protocols for coming together and developing fuel specifications and maintaining those specifications over time. So they play an integral part in all of this. So realizing that none of us, whether it's AOPA or EAA or Exxon or pick any entity out there, none of us on our own can come up with the solution. We have to work together. So earlier this year we put together what's been called the AvGas Coalition, which you may have heard about. And the purpose of this group was to collaborate, coordinate, and provide leadership on the development and implementation of the process. And I've underlined and italicized the process. We're not creating and choosing fuels. We are putting forth a process that will allow this activity to happen in a cohesive way to develop the unleaded AvGas solution. And our role is unique in the sense that it can provide a balanced approach because everybody's at the table. All of the sometimes competing, sometimes complementary interests are there. And the result will be the process. We're not trying to create the fuel, but the process that will allow the marketplace, which ultimately is us, it's us as pilots and aircraft owners, to arrive and identify the best possible solution that is technically feasible and economically reasonable. The members of the AvGas coalition will sound pretty familiar to you. There's the aircraft operating owner groups like AOPA, EAA, and BAA. The aircraft manufacturers are represented by GAMA, but many of their member companies work directly with us, of course. And then there's the fixed base operators, the points of sale, represented by NATA, and then very, very importantly, the AvGas producers are at the table, and not just individual companies, but their representative organizations, American Petroleum Institute and the National Petrochemical and Refiners Association. This is very, very important because when we're dealing with the petroleum industry, antitrust comes into play a great deal, and we can't necessarily talk in the open with multiple petroleum companies in the room about things like producibility and economics, but through their overarching associations, if you will, some of that can occur. So the goal of the coalition is this, is to establish a process to identify the most viable unleaded solution to replace 100 low lead, taking into account aviation safety, environmental improvements, technical feasibility, aircraft operability, economic impact, and the ability to produce and distribute at a reasonable cost. As our guiding principles, we have to assure safety. Nothing can happen if it compromises safety, and that includes banning lead. If we don't have a safe alternative, we can't go there, and that is the message we consistently deliver to EPA on this. We have to minimize the impact on the existing fleet, because let's face it, the existing fleet is the fleet we're going to have. We will build new aircraft, but not in the numbers necessary to replace the existing fleet. It is the fleet we have. And then we have to do this in a way that will ensure the sustainability of growth of GA in the long term. So what is this plan? Well, there's two separate strategies to address the near and the long-term EPA actions we talked about earlier. Remember that in the short term, we were talking about the National Ambient Air Quality Standard changes and the tenfold reduction in the permissible levels of lead. That's near term. We have that to confront in the immediate years in front of us. So the first part of the plan goes after that. The second part addresses the longer term endangerment finding process, which I described earlier, and which leads us to the need over the long haul to identify a replacement for 100 low lead. So we've broken this down into hopefully manageable pieces. So the near term strategy is to try to provide some reductions in lead emissions from GA up front. And we're doing that in a way that will create what we hope will be a very low lead 100 octane AvGas, or 100 VLL is the working term we're using today. This is again intended to be drop-in, and remember I said drop-in means no modifications, no aircraft specific approvals from FAA. And what we're trying to achieve here is about a 20% reduction in lead from the maximum permissible content under the specifications today. We think we can do that. Whether it's 15, 20, we're not there yet. We've just, in fact, completed a research report, which is being validated at ASTM right now, to begin to build the technical case for this reduction. But the purpose of this is to do it in a transparent way and to basically show in good faith an overall lowered total lead emissions nationwide, and then also to help address any of the potential problems we might have at airport-specific monitoring sites that are found not to be in compliance with the NAAQS. So we're trying to get ahead of this thing because it takes years to make even relatively small leaps like this. It sounds so simple, but before we get all of the data and go through the approval processes and the specification processes and ensure ultimately that it's safe for our use, it's not an overnight process. So we need to be doing this now, even though the implementation may be 2017. So we're trying to get ahead of this. The longer term strategy is the one that we've all kind of been more focused on, and that is dealing with the long-term replacement for 100 low lead. First and foremost, FAA, I think, coming into this program felt that they just had a sort of a backseat role. Industry, y'all go out and you'll create the fuel, you'll find a fuel that works, and then we'll approve it. We need them every step of the way in this process, and what we're doing as a coalition right now is looking to seeking the development of an integrated industry, pardon the misspelling there, and FAA program that will allow us to coordinate and gather all the information and coordinate all of the data and research activities necessary to bring the information together we need as a marketplace to identify the best outcome. And again, it has to be technically feasible and economically reasonable. So it's not just a question of does it work in the engine, but can it be produced and widely distributed? All of those things play a part. And if you don't have those, any one of those, you don't have a successful, viable candidate. We're envisioning this partnership to look something like the CAFE program that was used for the biojet fuel research and development in recent years. And that's the model. We're not looking to replicate it exactly because we have some much more complicated issues we're trying to address, both in terms of technical and programmatic. But it was a pretty successful model for bringing everybody under the same umbrella and managing the process. So we're looking at that, and the important thing is it involves all the interested parties. First steps, once that's put together, is to identify those areas of the existing fuel specifications that can be adjusted to accommodate some of these new and novel chemical blends. We talked about distillation curve. That's just one of the many that we need to look at. And as we identify those, we need to then be able to enable the research and fund the research so that we can evaluate the operational impact of these changes and determine what's an appropriate level or an acceptable level or not. Once we've gone through that iterative process, we will then be able to define the criteria for a viable unleaded AvGas. In other words, you'll have the envelope in which you can work. And hopefully it's a bigger envelope than the one we have today with the specification for 100 low lead. And so once you have that envelope, you can begin to assess the candidate fuels, the things that are being worked on out there against that data and say, is this acceptable? Will it work? Won't it work? And you can begin to weed out, the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. And then once you're down to that level, we need to develop an engine and aircraft certification process that will transition the existing fleet to the new fuel. I skipped over that pretty quickly, but that is an immensely complicated process. But one that would take up the rest of the evening if we were to dwell on it for very long. Phase 3 is to develop and approve an ASTM fuel specification once we have that universe narrowed down to what's the fuel going to look like. And then, ultimately, we have to certify, as a first step, new production aircraft to the new fuel. That's the easiest. Produce new products that will accept the new fuel. And you go after that one first. And you set a deadline that says after X year, new production aircraft will only be able to burn this unleaded fuel. The key to success with that is that whatever the new fuel is has to also be compatible with and fungible with 100 low lead, because you could go, as we begin to transition this, you could go to one airport and all you can find is 100 low lead. You can go to another airport and all you'll find is this new unleaded fuel, and you'll have a half a tank of each. Well, you need to be able to successfully meld them together and use them in a blended in any ratio between the two. So that is one of the keys to success in this. And then ultimately, once we arrive at this next unleaded fuel and we are producing new aircraft and engines to the new fuel, we have to then go back and regulate a transition of the existing fleet. Let's face it, unless there's a regulatory end date, there's no incentive to produce anything but 100 low lead. It's the cheapest thing we're likely to find. We know it works. Why would we stop? So at some point in this process, there will have to be an end date, whether that's 5, 10, 15, 25, 50 years. I'm not, no preconceived notions, but at some point there has to be a deadline. The transition timeline will be dependent upon how radically different the fuel is from what we have today. The more different it is, the more complicated the things like FAA approvals and certifications become. And the more different it is, the more difficult the impact it might be on the production and distribution infrastructure for the fuel itself. So the transition really is going to be very, very dependent upon where all of this data leads us over time. So it's hard to preconceive what that's going to look like. But no matter what, the regulation will need to consider any special provisions for those segments of the fleet that may not be able to transition successfully or within the timeline. So there have to be sort of off-ramps for those considerations. So what's EAA doing today? Well, first and foremost, we maintain a relationship with the EPA, and we have for years and years and years, which is one reason we haven't had regulation before now. I would say the height of advocacy success is to have gone from 1990 to 2010 and not having to have a specific worry about our AvGas. So I'll chalk that up as a success for EAA and AOPA and others who've been deeply involved in this issue. But that's happened because we've been continually educating the EPA on the complexity of this issue and the safety and technical barriers we're up against, the economic impacts, and so forth. Obviously, we filed the comments with the coalition to the ANPRM earlier this summer, and in that we emphasized the need for the FAA's leadership. We addressed questions that EPA posed. We highlighted the need for more data and analysis because, frankly, we think that the case that EPA has built around the endangerment finding is pretty thin, and in fact that there needs to be a great deal more data, and on and on. So it was a fairly comprehensive set of comments. We also partner with the FAA, and we are in direct dialogue with the FAA administrator and his senior staff on this. We have had meeting after meeting with them because, as I mentioned earlier, they weren't really bought into what their level of participation and activity should be with this. And we've had to bring them up to speed to come to accept that they have a pivotal role in this process. So we've continued to stress the need for their leadership and that only they can create this quasi-CAFE program. Only they can help us address the certification hurdles to certifying the existing fleet to a new fuel. We need to make sure that they have adequate funding and staffing for this research undertaking. So there are many, many avenues at FAA that we have to pursue simultaneously. And the FAA Tech Center in Atlantic City has done yeoman work over the last 20 years in this area. They have been the place where most of the testing has been done, and we continue to have to ensure that they are properly funded and staffed so that we can use that resource going forward. And then finally, we spent a great deal of time on Capitol Hill. We've engaged in briefings to legislators and their staff. That resulted this summer in their support for extension of the comment period for the ANPRM. We've had some letters sent to the EPA administrator expressing concerns over the impact of this sort of rulemaking path that EPA is on, and pressing that in fact general aviation is not unduly impacted by this. There has been additional interest in the FAA reauthorization process, which we talk about repeatedly over the years because we just haven't been able to get a reauthorization bill. But now in reauthorization and the appropriations bills, we're beginning to see language in there that's a direct result of our activities, identifying the alternative AvGas research programs as being a priority. And we've garnered an additional $2 million in FAA's budget for research and development this year, and should we get a reauthorization bill passed at some point, that would carry forth for an additional 5 years as well. So, as I said, there's many facets that have to be managed to this issue on all fronts, on the regulatory side, the congressional side, the technical, the economic. It's all across the board, and somehow all of this has to happen in a cohesive way. So, as you may gather, this is an immensely complex issue. It's going to take us a number of years to resolve. This is not something that's going to change. Your fuel isn't going to go away next week, next month, next year. If I have anything to say with it, it may not go away this decade. So what we are trying to do, though, is to manage our way through this process and not end up at a regulatory deadline or a congressional deadline or mandate with our pants down, without having done the diligence to have the next fuel ready, the research conducted, the safety studies done, so that when we get to the point that things have to change, we're there. That's the goal. Manage this thing forward and don't get caught by surprise or taken by a regulatory deadline that we can't manage. Whatever the outcome, it is going to be the most significant sweeping change we have ever seen in this industry. We have never, ever tried to recertify an entire fleet to a new fuel. This is new ground. So we're learning as we go, and that's one reason it takes so long. But caution is the watchword. In the meantime, we'll continue to press where appropriate for the availability of autogas that is not blended with ethanol. It is my sincere hope that that window of opportunity opens, whether it's with the new Congress or with changing public attitudes toward ethanol, there are some very preliminary signs of changing in thinking about these things. So we will capitalize on them where we can. Most importantly, to you, to me, to all of us that love aviation and the CAA family, is we must have a suitable unleaded high-octane fuel that will satisfy the existing fleet before 100 low lead goes away. We have to maintain the continued availability of 100 low lead until we have a satisfactory solution. That's my job. That's what I do every day. And that's why we spend so much time with people like the EPA and Congress. FAA gets it. They get it from a technical standpoint. But we have to manage these outside influences, and that's what you folks pay us in Oshkosh and here in Washington to do for you. So I want to thank you very, very much for your attention. I know this has been a bit of a trek, and we've really just glossed over the surface of it. If you have any additional comments you'd like to submit, please do so. If we don't get them covered in the Q&A session that follows here, you're welcome to send them to my attention at thegovernment@eaa.org. I would only ask, please, don't expect me. I just don't have the capacity to respond to everybody. But please, please know that I do read all of your letters and emails and discussion threads on Oshkosh 365, and I absolutely take everything you say and feel into consideration, as we all do at EAA. So please don't be bashful, and as I know you're not, in sending your comments, and please rest assured that they will be absolutely considered. So thank you so much for your time and attention, and I'll turn this back to Charlie.
Okay, Doug, we do have some questions. I'm sure we will not get through them all, so it's great that you have a place where people can send them for your review and consideration. First, let's just start off with Stephen. He's got a good question, which is kind of lingering in my mind from your presentation as well, which is there's some airports in Florida and also here in Wisconsin that sell the unleaded ethanol-free premium MoGas. So you seem to imply that might be in jeopardy given these new standards. So is this new bill going to stop that availability, or will that continue?
It doesn't specifically stop the availability, and that's an excellent question. Where airports or marinas, or there's a variety of people desperately trying to find untainted, if you will, autogas, where they can get it, they're continuing to make it available, and it's highly desired and prized by the consumer, to be sure. The problem is that the realities of ethanol distribution start to overtake us, and again, because we are marginal users, we don't really have any input in the grand scale of either economics or practicalities of how the fuel is produced and distributed. But if we did, we'd be selling 82 UL today probably. Because ethanol is splash blended at the depot level, which means that ethanol doesn't go down the pipeline with the gasoline. For example, in Florida, on the East Coast, all of our gasoline, for all intents and purposes, is transported up a single pipeline. All the different grades, there's a little bit of commingling there. The gasoline goes untainted to the depot level or the regional level, and then ethanol is splash blended into the fuel. Ethanol is thus trucked from where ethanol is produced to where it's consumed. And the places where ethanol is consumed the most are in the large metropolitan areas. So in Florida, obviously, Miami is considered to be a non-attainment area for CO2 and other things. So reformulated gasoline is necessary, mandated, required. Ethanol is trucked down there. The reality of what happens is because ethanol is being distributed all along the way by truck, places in between that aren't necessarily regulated to have reformulated fuel end up with reformulated fuel. And I'll take you back to my discussion earlier about how the base fuel octane is dropping. So if they're sending down the pipeline this RBOB, this reformulated basic fuel that has a lower octane, the only way they can reach the 87, 89, 91 octane at the pump is by putting in the ethanol. So that's where this is going, and it becomes, again, from a distribution and economic standpoint, ever more difficult to find untainted gasoline. So while it may be available today, yeah, my implication is that that may become ever more difficult going forward because of these mandates and the realities that the petroleum industry faces and how they distribute their fuels.
Okay, what else? A couple of questions I'll try to summarize together. Is anything else going on around the world to develop a replacement? And are the Eastern European countries subject to these same lead restrictions, or do they just, operate independently on this issue?
That's a highly variable answer. You're asking me to comment on a worldwide scale. Regulations differ in different parts of the world. For example, in Australia, they still burn 100, 130, which was our green gas going back many years ago. In Sweden, they've been marketing a 91, 96 unleaded fuel for many, many years called 91 UL. In Eastern Europe, they haven't traditionally had the environmental regulations that we do, and thus have been able to continue to burn lead. So that's half the question. I think the other half of the question was, is there other research going on? And the answer is yes. But it's highly variable. And because we have a different fleet mix here than anywhere else in the world, and we have by far the largest. So what may work in some parts of the country, some parts of the world, may not be appropriate for us here in North America. So if your aircraft fleet in your country can get by on a 96 or a 94 or 91 octane fuel and you don't have that demand, that may be your regional solution. But clearly it's not here. But having said that, as we go forward, ASTM and fuel specifications are international specifications. So it's not like North America can just come up with its own fix and the rest of the world has to come along. We all work from the same specifications. So it is, in fact, an international effort. And there is research going on elsewhere in the world. And that sort of came under the heading of the other programs that are not necessarily happening with a lot of fanfare that I was referencing earlier.
Okay, what about the use of propane as either an additive or some sort of base fuel? Has anybody looked into that?
Yeah, gases have been looked at, and I'm going to qualify myself here and say that I don't think I'm the person to be answering that from a technical standpoint. But the short answer is yes. We have looked at gases. We have looked at neat ethanol. We've looked at ethers. Unfortunately, much of the research that was done in the 90s and early 2000s looked at octane enhancers coming out of the ethers. And for reasons having nothing to do with aviation, those ethers are no longer available for consumption here in North America. We may have heard about the groundwater contamination brought about by MTBE, and unfortunately, all of the ethers have been painted with the same brush as MTBE, including ETBE. And we have, I think, last count, I may get this wrong, but I think it was 30 or 33 states that have legislation now that prevents us from using ethers. They banned them in their states because of groundwater contamination. So that's a long way around saying, yes, a lot of things have been looked at, and there are so many different, as we talked about earlier, characteristics of fuel that have to be maintained that seemingly simple, well, if we just added that, we'd have it. Things just one by one get eliminated in the process, unfortunately.
Okay, down the road, it's looking like, when we have this replacement fuel, I mean, it looks like it's going to result in having to have two supply systems at an FBO. Is that our understanding? I mean, one to house the 100 low lead and one to house, future fuel?
Well, again, if you recall, I referenced that the fuels, whatever the fuel is that we have going forward, has to be fungible with 100 low lead. That is to say, they have to be able to work together. So no, we don't envision a dual distribution system for 100 low lead and the next high-octane unleaded fuel. We envision a transition from one to the other, and there will be a period of time when they're both on the market, and thus it's imperative that whatever the new high-octane unleaded fuel ends up being has to be able to work just as well in concert with, commingled with, in any proportion, 100 low lead. So we don't envision a dual distribution system for the high octane fuel.
Okay, I'm going to try to summarize a question or two here as well. Have we tried to work with the EPA to look at MoGas as when you talk about these short-term solutions to the leaded problem, it does seem like MoGas could be a way to cut our emissions in the short run, especially and if we could in any way leverage the boating industry and the other industries. Have we tried to put a coalition together with those folks?
Yes, we have. We have talked with Boat US and then National Maritime, I'm going to foul that up, Marine Manufacturers Association, MMA. That goes back a few years. We haven't talked to them this year, but we did have conversations a while back with them. I believe it was under different leadership at the time. So that may be an opportunity, but remember what I said earlier. E15 came about in the face of unanimous opposition from organizations much bigger than EAA, AOPA, and the marine industry. And the marine industry dwarfs us. The automotive industry opposed it outright. So short answer is yes, and we continue to be open to it. EPA, frankly, has tried to drive us. I mean, their initial take on this overall AvGas issue was, look, you guys just need a dual fuel system. All the aircraft that can burn a lower octane fuel should burn it. Anybody that needs a higher octane fuel should burn 100 low lead. We'll get a massive reduction in lead and go ye forth and do good in the world, and that'll tide us over for a while. And that is a very, very attractive outcome. We would love that. But as I said earlier, EAA can't create the marketplace. And we have fuels we could sell on airports today. You could sell 82 UL, which is untainted autogas for all intents and purposes, tomorrow. But the economics apparently aren't there because people aren't willing to make the investment in a second set of tanks to sell that fuel for the volume that they would sell. Until that marketplace emerges, there's not a whole lot that we as EAA can do to force the issue. The spec is on the shelf. We can do it now. And I'm not convinced, frankly, that given that if we were successful in taking the ethanol out of the premium grade of MoGas nationwide, that would change anything except for our members who are willing to transport the fuel themselves to the airport, which is wonderful. And I fully support that, and we want to work toward that. But again, in terms of the wholesale solution, dual tanks, lower octane fuel available in addition to 100 low lead, yeah, it would give us that reduction in lead, but at what cost? And so far, no one's been willing to bear that cost. It certainly couldn't be sold at MoGas prices if we were to do that. It would be carrying a price tag that is much, much higher, and then would people use it? So it's a very complicated issue. Economics do come into play. It's not purely just convince EPA and we'll go this route. Someone has to actually do it.
Okay, and I'm going to summarize a couple of questions here as well, and I think this one kind of captures it as, not to be negative, but it seems like this has been out there, and here we are 20 or more years down the road, and it just doesn't seem like we've moved it that far. I mean, is that fair, or is that just the perception?
Oh, I think it's perfectly fair. A lot of time has gone by. What's not fair, though, is the intimation, and I don't think that's being made here, but I've certainly heard it elsewhere, that you've spent 20 years and done nothing. We've spent 20 years and done a whole lot. Just because you work your tail off and don't come up with the answer doesn't mean you're not doing anything. It just means that maybe there isn't an answer handy. Very almost tongue-in-cheek, I have to say, though, the best possible outcome, at least for the past 20 years, has been the status quo. If anybody believes that the next fuel is going to be cheaper than 100 low lead, they're kidding themselves. If we believe that the next fuel is going to perform better than 100 low lead, we're kidding ourselves. The data does not bear that out. So from a purely safety and operational and economic standpoint, the best possible outcome I could possibly achieve on behalf of our members is the status quo. And that's where we've been for the last 20 years. But at the same time, we can't just sit back and say we're not going to do this. We have to do this because of the economics that we've talked about earlier and, of course, the environmental regulations. So it's a very delicate balance we're striking between making sure our members have the best possible outcome for the longest period of time while ensuring a safe and sensible and economic future. that's what you folks pay us to do, and that's what all of the advocacy organizations involved in aviation, that's the fine line we've been walking, and we continue to walk in this. We're not dragging our feet toward a solution, but we also have to make sure we do diligence along the way and do this appropriately and safely, while at the same time making it clear that we are going to get to an unleaded future. There is no question about it. We have to. So I guess the quickest answer I can give is I think the status quo has been the best possible outcome, at least the last 2 decades. We would not have wanted to rush into this in 1995. It would have been a mess.
Excellent. Well, Doug, I've been here 11 years working at EAA, so I'm fairly tuned into this issue, and I got to admit I learned a tremendous amount tonight. So I want to thank you taking the time to brief us all on this. It is now 15 minutes past our usual stop time, so I'm going to call it quits at this point. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. I hope you learned as much as I did. Doug, once again, if they want to submit some comments to you, your email's on screen. You will read them all. So thank you very much for taking the time. And any last comments before we sign off?
No, I just want to thank everybody for paying attention to the issue, and just very, very grateful that I feel very privileged to be able to do the job I do and on behalf of the community I do, and really is an honor, and I thank you for your time and attention this evening.
Excellent. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in, and with that we're going to sign off, and you have a great evening. Bye now.